Спасибо, Бог, за лунный свет, за дивный мир других планет, за каждый миг, который проживу я. За радость, грусть, за свет и тень, за самый лучший в жизни день, за каждый новый вздох мой. Аллилуйя, 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 аллилуйя.
We left off with the dispersion of the northern tribes of Israel and their captivity under the Neo-Assyrian Empire in 722 BC, and the captivity of the kingdom of Judah under the Neo-Babylonian Empire in 586 BC. It will be after these events that we're going to see how the dispersion of the Israelites will pave the way for the rise of the Aryan nations. Our story will now take us to Neo-Babylon, where the great king Nebuchadnezzar dreamed a dream that was so frightening that he ordered all the wise men of Babylon and their families to be killed if the wise men couldn't tell him his dream and the interpretation of it. For hidden in his dream lies the future of the world, the destruction of Babylon and the rise of the Aryan nations where the Israelites had been dispersed into. Before we venture further into our story, let's draw a comparison between the time of Abraham to where we are now, since the story of Abraham begins in the same land where the Jews are now captives. The story of Abraham goes back about 1400 years before Judah's captivity to the land of their nativity back to Old Babylonia in approximately 2000 BC, during the reign of the third dynasty of Ur in the land of the Chaldeans who ruled southern Mesopotamia, while Assyria or Ashur ruled from the north. Together they would rule the eastern part of the Fertile Crescent, or the cradle of civilization, while Egypt ruled the western part of the Fertile Crescent. The Bible says God chose the land of Canaan to be the promised land for Abraham's children and the kingdom of Israel, a land that happens to perfectly mediate trade between these two foundational kingdoms, with access to the Mediterranean and the Red Sea for optimal trade and travel. This is important because the Hebrew Semites start in Mesopotamia, but are then mixed with Egyptians. The sons of Joseph, the chosen sons and heirs of Israel, are a perfect mixture of both these two great kingdoms, since Joseph was a Hebrew Semite and his wife was the daughter of an Egyptian royal priest. So the Bible says God created Israel from what Jews today called goyim or goys, which is foolish for Jews to use this as a derogatory word, since God calls Israel by this term goy in the book of Exodus when he is establishing them as a nation. So don't take too much offense when Jews call you goy, since the Jews themselves are goys according to God and Moses. The Bible tells the ending from the beginning. Abraham was an uncircumcised Gentile from Mesopotamia who was saved by the grace of God through his faith, not through his works. There was no temple for him to perform ritualistic animal sacrifices. Neither did the Torah or law exist, which wouldn't come until Moses centuries later. Abraham also partook in bread and wine rituals with a priest from Canaan named Melchizedek, who was both king and high priest of Salem, and his name means "my king is righteousness." This parallels Jesus, who was also called king and high priest in the New Testament. So the life of Abraham is really a foreshadowing of Christianity and what the Apostle Paul would preach. So the teachings of Paul existed in Abraham before there was ever a temple in Jerusalem. All that the New Testament is doing is bringing us back to the original faith of Abraham, which is something Pharisaic Jews can't seem to understand. Looking at the two nations that the Bible says God used to build the nation of Israel, we have the Egyptians from the line of Cam, not Ham like how we see in the English Bibles. This is important since the land of Egypt was originally called Kemet, but is now called Mizra in the east after Cam's son Mizraim. The other nation are Semites from Shem, who conquered Mesopotamia and started the Akkadian Empire under Sargon of Akkad. Israel is a mixture of the two. The legacy of the Kamites, or Egyptians, include the alphabet, paper, writing, science, architecture, and disputed the plow, literature, religion, and irrigation. The legacy of the Semites and ancient Sumerians include law, astronomy, chronology, cartography, agriculture, mathematics, the wheel, and disputed the plow, literature, religion, and irrigation. While most of biblical history is focused around the Semites in Mesopotamia and the Kamites in Egypt, It will be the Aryan Japhites and their innovations who will unite the ancient past and lay the foundation for the modern-day world. One of the most remarkable inventions passed down to us by the Aryans was the Kenet, or channel system they built in Iran. Their ability to move and divert water under the earth allowed them to create paradise gardens in barren desert wastelands. This is where the word paradise comes from the old Iranian word paradis. The Aryans' engineering skills to divert water will be the knowledge that they will use to destroy the world's superpower in only a single night. The kingdom of Babylon will never rise again. So let us understand, God created Israel by mixing people from Mesopotamia and Egypt together, the two mighty kingdoms of the Fertile Crescent. Now we're going to see how God will scatter this mixed people, now called Israel, into the Aryan nations as they will rise to world power. Again, I want to reiterate as you watch this video that most languages spoken in the Western world are Aryan or Indo-European languages from Japheth, but we use a modern Semitic Hebrew script to write our alphabet, which the Semites learned in Egypt, where the alphabet was actually invented. The alphabet is Egyptian, the script is Semitic, but the language is Aryan, which matches the story of the Israelites with 100% accuracy. So let's begin where we left off. In 722 BC, the world was under Assyrian rule, and the northern kingdom of Israel was shattered and dispersed among the nations, never to rise again. However, the kingdom of Judah would remain for almost 150 years before going into captivity under Neo-Babylon. God promised Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and the sons of Joseph that their children would be scattered around the world, that kings and nations would be born from their children in order to bless the world. The prophet Isaiah reminds us that Israel will be a light for all the other nations to follow. And he said, "It is a light thing that thou shouldest be my servant, to raise up the tribes of Jacob, and to restore the preserved of Israel. I will also give thee for a light to the Gentiles, that thou mayest be my salvation unto the ends of the earth." After the Israelites seemed to vanish from history in 722 BC, we have two notable tribes showing up in history that rose up around the Scythian tribes surrounding the Black Sea, one called the Cimmerians and the other called the Sarmatians, similar to the name of Israel's capital, Samaria. During the Greek era, many Scythian Israelites apparently returned back to Israel, and the Greeks called their city Scythopolis or Scythopolis. We also have the rise of Carthage, which was a Tyrian Israelite colony, or Phoenician as we call them today, and their Aryan Roman rivals who rose up around the same time. The Romans' greatest rival was a Celtic tribe called the Gauls, who appeared in France and in Iberia, which is Portugal and Spain today. Some scholars suggest that the name Portugal comes from the Latin words portus Gallia, meaning the gateway to the Gauls. This is interesting because the Gauls show up in recorded history in the 5th century BC, shortly after Israel vanished, and the Hebrew word for exiles happens to be the Hebrew word galut or Gala. The Gauls would eventually occupy modern-day France and conquer all the way into Anatolia or modern-day Turkey. This is important because one of the books in the New Testament is addressed specifically to the Gauls and is called the Book of Galatians, or the Book to the Exiles, the Gala. Gauls are considered a Celtic people, but not all Celts are considered Gauls. We also have the rise of the Aryan Hellenes, or Greeks, who will rise up to become the first European people to conquer all the great kingdoms in the East. While they are the first European people to conquer the civilized world, they are not the first Aryans to rule, since they will first have to conquer their Median cousins to claim the title of masters of the world. It is very important to pay attention to the kingdom of Media, which is one of the central kingdoms where the Assyrians exiled the house of Israel, since it will be this land where the Israelites were exiled to that will soon emerge as the new world power, fulfilling the promises made to the sons of Joseph. The Neo-Assyrian Empire ruled from about 911 BC to about 609 BC, and is probably the most brutal and bloody of all the ancient kingdoms. They would meet their end at the hands of Nabopolassar, or Nabopolassar, the king of Babylon, and his ally Cyaxares, or Cyaxares, the king of Media. Their alliance was consolidated by the marriage of Nabopolassar's son, Nebuchadnezzar, and a princess of Media named Amytis. After the capital of Assyria, Nineveh, was destroyed by the Babylonians, Medians, and their coalition of allies in 613 BC, the Assyrians would fall back to Haran in Syria, which is a very important city, since it was once the home to Abraham, but it was also the home of the wives of Israel, and where 11 of Israel's sons were born and raised. In 609 BC, King Necho of Egypt would march his army towards Syria to assist his beaten Assyrian allies from the Babylonians and the Medians. The great king of Judah, Josiah, would attempt to intercept Egypt in the plains of Jezreel at Megiddo to assist the Babylonians. Necho, an Ethiopian king of Egypt, warned Josiah to let him pass, since his war was with the king of Babylon and not with him. Josiah, being loyal to the Babylonians, ignored Necho's warning, where he was wounded at the Battle of Megiddo. The word Armageddon actually comes from the word Megiddo. It simply means Mount Megiddo, Har Megiddo, not the end of the world, but in Judah's case, it would mean the end of their kingdom. As the Egyptians pushed forward towards Syria to defend their beaten Assyrian allies, the last great king of Judah would die from his wounds, and the kingdom of Judah would now be destined for destruction. King Josiah is recorded as the greatest king in the history of Judah's independence, and accomplished many great things. But his sons who are to follow were wicked and evil in the eyes of God. They would be the last sons of David to rule as kings until the crucifixion of Christ. With Assyria in ruins, the ancient world wondered in anticipation to see who would emerge as the next world power, Egypt or Babylon. However, no one would be able to predict how this story would end, except for the prophet Isaiah, who had already written this story down about 2 centuries before. With the Egyptian-Assyrian alliance preparing to make their last stand against their Babylonian and Median rivals, Necho, the king of Egypt, would dethrone the newly crowned king of Judah, Jehoaz, and make his brother Eliakim the new king of Judah, who was then renamed to Jehoiakim. The Babylonian-Median alliance would destroy the Egyptian-Assyrian army at the Battle of Carchemish, sending the Egyptians into full retreat back to Egypt, and the Assyrian Empire would cease to exist. After Assyria was destroyed, the Medians would take the lands in the north, while the Babylonians would take the lands in the south. Assyria and its capital Nineveh were destroyed so badly that the great and terrible city would eventually fade into mythology, and for over a millennium, Christians would be mocked for believing in the lost and fabled city. It wouldn't be until the mid-19th century that Austin Layard and his team of archaeologists would uncover the great city, along with the library of King Ashurbanipal, who was one of the greatest kings of Assyria that built the greatest ancient library to ever be discovered, where we can read the Assyrian records that mention the kings of Israel by name, along with similar biblical events, but from the perspective of the Assyrians. After the prince of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, emerged victorious at the Battle of Carchemish, he marched on Judah and besieged it. King Jehoiakim switched his allegiance and was forced to pay tribute to Babylon. Some of the temple artifacts were taken, as well as some of the royal princes, so there was peace between Babylon and Judah, but only for a while. In 605 BC, Nebuchadnezzar's father, Nabopolassar, would die, which forced him to return back to Babylon to secure his throne before he could conquer Egypt. Among the captives that returned to Babylon with Nebuchadnezzar were 4 young Jewish nobles who were from the royal line. These 4 Jews were called Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah, and Daniel the prophet, whose Hebrew names were changed to Babylonian names Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, and Daniel became Belteshazzar. The destruction of Israel and the captivity of the Jews is marked by the time of the 4 major prophets: Isaiah, who wrote in the 8th century before Israel's dispersion; Jeremiah, who wrote from Judah during its destruction; Ezekiel, who was among the captives; and Daniel, who was in Babylon. So we're going to follow the prophet Daniel into Babylon, where God will send Nebuchadnezzar a haunting dream that will predict the future of the world and the rise of the Aryan nations. The Bible so far has taken us through Mesopotamia, to the old and new kingdoms of Egypt, then to the founding of the nation of Israel, then to the Assyrians with the dispersion of the northern tribes. Now, the Bible will take us through the next 4 great empires and the 4 greatest conquerors of the ancient world: Neo-Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and Rome. The book of Daniel is probably the most unique book in the entire Old Testament, since it is a book that completely predicts the future of the world from Judah's captivity to the coming of Christ. Second, it doesn't matter if you believe in the Bible or not. Simply by memorizing the story of the Israelites, you can memorize the order of all the ancient empires that came before us. Pharisaic Jews, for some reason, have removed the book of Daniel from the prophets and placed it into the writings when it is the most prophetic book in the entire Bible. It was also passed down to us mainly in Aramaic. You'll notice how it starts in Hebrew, but between chapters 2 and 7, it makes a switch to Aramaic. Also, you'll notice that chapter 4 is the only chapter in the entire Old Testament that was written by a non-Israelite. It was written by the great King Nebuchadnezzar, where he gives a great and terrible warning to the kings and rulers of the earth who think they are ruling the world. So let's go to Babylon and learn the great and terrible dream of King Nebuchadnezzar. And in the 2nd year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, Nebuchadnezzar dreamed dreams, and his spirit was troubled, and his sleep went from him. Then the king commanded to call the magicians, and the enchanters, and the sorcerers, and the Chaldeans, to tell the king his dream. So they came in and stood before the king. And the king said unto them, I have dreamed a dream, and my spirit is troubled to know the dream. Then spake the Chaldeans to the king in the Syrian language, O king, live forever. Tell your servants the dream, and we will show the interpretation. The king answered and said to the Chaldeans, The thing is gone from me. If you will not make known unto me the interpretation of it, you shall be cut in pieces, and your houses shall be made as dunghills. But if you show the dream and the interpretation of it, you shall receive of me gifts and rewards and great honors. Therefore show me the dream and the interpretation of it. They answered a second time and said, Let the king tell his servants the dream, and we will show the interpretation. The king answered and said, I know of certainty that you would gain time, because you see, the thing is gone from me. But if you do not make known unto me the dream, there is but one law for you. For you have prepared lying and corrupt words to speak before me, till the time be changed. Therefore tell me the dream, and I shall know that you can show me the interpretation of it. The Chaldeans answered before the king, and said, There is not a man upon the earth that can show the king's matter. Forasmuch as no king, lord, or ruler has asked such a thing of any magician or enchanter or Chaldean. And it is a rare thing that the king requires, and there is no other that can show it before the king, except the gods, whose dwelling is not with flesh. For this cause was the king angry and furious, and commanded to destroy all the wise men of Babylon. So the decree went forth, and the wise men were to be slain, and they sought Daniel and his companions to be slain. Then Daniel returned to answer with counsel and prudence to Arioch the captain of the king's guard, who was gone forth to slay the wise men of Babylon. He answered and said to Arioch the king's captain, Why is the decree so urgent from the king? Then Arioch made the thing known to Daniel. And Daniel went in and desired of the king that he would appoint him a time, and he would show the king the interpretation. Then Daniel went to his house, and made the thing known to Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah his companions, that they would desire mercies of the God of heaven concerning this secret, that Daniel and his companions should not perish with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. Then was the secret revealed unto Daniel in a vision of the night. Then Daniel blessed the God of heaven. Daniel answered and said, Blessed be the name of God forever and ever, for wisdom and might are his. And he changes the times and the seasons. He removes kings and sets up kings. He gives wisdom unto the wise, and knowledge to them that have understanding. He reveals the deep and secret things. He knows what is in the darkness, and the light dwells with him. I thank you and praise you, O thou God of my fathers, who has given me wisdom and might, and has now made known unto me what we desire of you, for you have made known unto us the king's matter. Therefore Daniel went in unto Arioch, whom the king had appointed to destroy the wise men of Babylon. He went and said unto him, Destroy not the wise men of Babylon, bring me before the king, and I will show unto the king the interpretation. Then Arioch brought in Daniel before the king in haste, and said unto him, I have found a man of the children of the captivity of Judah, that will make known unto the king the interpretation. The king answered and said to Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar, Are you able to make known unto me the dream which I have seen, and the interpretation of it? Daniel answered before the king, and said, The secret which the king has demanded can neither wise man, enchanter, magician, nor soothsayer show unto the king. But there is a God in heaven that reveals secrets, and he has made known unto the king Nebuchadnezzar what shall be in the latter days. Your dream and the vision of your head upon your bed are these. As for you, O king, your thoughts came in unto your mind upon your bed, what should come to pass hereafter, and he that reveals secrets has made known to you what shall come to pass. But as for me, the secret is not revealed to me for any wisdom that I have more than any living, but for the intent that the interpretation may be known to the king, and that you may know the thoughts of your heart. You, O king, saw and behold a great image. This image was mighty, and whose brightness was excellent, stood before you, and the aspect of it was terrible. As for this image, its head was of fine gold, its chest and its arms of silver, its belly and its thighs of brass, its legs of iron, its feet part of iron and part of clay. You saw that a stone was cut without hands, which smote the image upon its feet that were of iron and clay, and brake them in pieces. Then was the iron, the clay, the brass, the silver, and the gold broken in pieces together, and became like the chaff of the summer threshing floors, and the wind carried them away, so that no place was found for them. And the stone that smote the image became a great mountain, and filled the whole earth. This is the dream, and we will tell the interpretation of it before the king. You, O king, are King of kings, unto whom the God of heaven has given the kingdom, the power, and the strength, and the glory. And wheresoever the children of men dwell, the beasts of the field, and the birds of the heavens, has he given into your hands, and has made you to rule over them all. You are the head of gold. And after you shall arise another kingdom inferior to yours, and another third kingdom of brass, which shall bear rule over all the earth. And the fourth kingdom shall be strong as iron, for as much as iron breaks in pieces and subdues all things, and as iron that crushes all these, shall it break in pieces and crush. And whereas you saw the feet and toes part of potter's clay and part of iron, it shall be a divided kingdom, but there shall be in it of the strength of the iron, for as much as you saw the iron mixed with the miry clay. And as the toes of the feet were part of iron and part of clay, so the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly broken. And whereas you saw the iron mixed with miry clay, they shall mingle themselves with the seed of men, but they shall not cleave one to another, even as iron does not mingle with clay. And in the days of those kings shall the God of heaven set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed, nor shall the sovereignty thereof be left to another people. But it shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever. For as much as you saw that a stone was cut out of the mountain without hands, and that it brake in pieces the iron, the brass, the clay, the silver, and the gold, the great God has made known to the king what shall come to pass hereafter, and the dream is certain, and the interpretation of it sure. Then the king Nebuchadnezzar fell upon his face, and worshipped Daniel, and commanded that they should offer an oblation and sweet odors unto him. The king answered unto Daniel, and said, Of a truth, your God is the God of gods, and the Lord of kings, and a revealer of secrets, seeing that you have been able to reveal this secret. Then the king made Daniel great, and gave him many great gifts, and made him to rule over the whole province of Babylon, to be the chief governor over all the wise men of Babylon. And Daniel requested of the king, and he appointed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over the affairs of the province of Babylon, but Daniel was in the gate of the king. So let's examine this story. So right away we can see that Nebuchadnezzar has no respect for the priests and wise men of Babylon, probably because he spent most of his life on the battlefield fighting in wars, and he was not the pious and religious man as his father before him was. He gives the wise men an impossible task. Not only were they to interpret his dream, but they must first tell him what he saw, to make sure that he was speaking for the gods. In the ancient world, dreams were very important. In ancient Egypt, for example, dreams were part of the religion, as they believed all dreams were prophetic and came from the gods. The skill wasn't in having dreams, but having the power to interpret their meanings. Ancient Egyptians actually had a dream book where you could go and speak to a priest concerning your dream, and the priests would search the records and the scrolls to tell you what your dream meant. They didn't just make it up on the spot. When it comes to the Chaldeans, they were considered the wisest men in the land, which happens to be the same land where Abraham originally came from. It is also worth pointing out the order of the metals. As the value of the metals decreases, the metals or the empires become stronger. The head of gold is identified as Nebuchadnezzar and the Neo-Babylonian Empire, the last Semitic empire to rule over the ancient world. The second empire, being represented by the silver arms and chest, is the Medo-Persian Empire, being led by Cyrus the Great and later Darius the Great. It is mainly an Aryan nation, but it is heavily influenced and mixed with Semites. The third empire, represented by the thighs and belly of bronze or brass that will conquer the Medo-Persians, are the Hellenes, led by Alexander the Great, the king of Macedonia, the first European people to conquer the civilized world. The fourth and final empire, represented by the legs of iron and feet and toes of iron mixed with miry clay, is the Roman Empire, being led by Julius Caesar. Last, the stone that was cut without hands, that smashed the image and turned all the empires to dust, is Christ and the coming of the Messianic era, which will last forever. Let us remember the promise made to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, who was then renamed to Israel, and to Joseph's sons Ephraim and Manasseh, that nations and kings would come from them, that Israel would be scattered around the world, and that all the world would be blessed through them. It is very important to examine Daniel's mannerisms. Even though he is the one who holds the knowledge and the interpretation of the dream, he makes sure to give all the credit to God, and makes it clear that all of this was ordained by God so that the world would know that God is the one who ordains kings and powers. It's important to point out that the first Aryan nation that will conquer the Babylonians, represented by the silver chest and arms, is the same kingdom of Media where the Israelites had been mixed into for nearly 2 centuries before they would conquer Babylon and liberate the Jews. One arm representing the Persians and the other arm representing the Medes, with one arm folded above the other. This represents the unity between the Medes and Persians. Cyrus the Great was the king of Ashan in the province of Elam and would conquer his grandfather's kingdom of Media, and also the kingdom of Lydia, from which his mother's lineage descended from. He would conquer these nations in a most amazing and prophetic way. Cyrus the Great is the only king in the Bible mentioned by name 200 years before he would conquer Babylon in the book of Isaiah. Thus saith the Lord to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I have holden, to subdue nations before him. And I will loosen the loins of kings, to open before him 2-leaved gates, and the gates shall not be shut. The Greeks or Hellenes are represented by the belly and thighs of bronze, the thighs representing the speed and power of the Hellenes, as they would conquer the Medo-Persians with speed and power that the world had never seen before. The story of Alexander the Great can be found in the book of Daniel in chapter 8, in the form of a parable, and the Greek civil wars that are to come in Daniel chapter 11. The Hellenes are another Aryan nation where the Israelites were mixed into, as we learn from Josephus, the Gospels, Paul, and the Jewish letters addressed to the Spartans, calling them the seed of Abraham. The fourth and final empire, represented by the iron legs with the feet and toes mixed with iron and miry clay, represents the Roman Empire and the 10 lost tribes who had been scattered into them for nearly 7 centuries since Israel's destruction and disappearance. Julius Caesar is probably the greatest conqueror in ancient history. Julius Caesar became the conqueror of Gaul and managed to unite the warring Gallic factions and bring them as far as England, where they discovered the Celtic Britons who greeted them with war chariots and were far more advanced than the Romans had anticipated. When the Roman Senate had fallen into total corruption, Caesar would march his veteran Roman army over the Rubicon River, declaring war on the corrupt Roman government. Julius Caesar and his army traveled from Gaul to England to Rome to Spain, some of his legions into North Africa, and against all odds, Julius Caesar destroyed the Roman Senate's army at the Battle of Pharsalus in Greece, where Caesar defeated his longtime friend and rival, Pompey the Great, who was the Roman general who conquered the Jews in Judea in 63 BC. Julius Caesar later went to Egypt, where he was rescued by Antipater, which is extremely important since it was Antipater who founded the Herodian dynasty, the Edomite kings who ruled in Judea during the time of Christ until the destruction of Jerusalem. After Julius Caesar was betrayed and murdered by the Roman Senate, whom many of the senators he had pardoned, the empire would pass to his Roman heir Octavian, starting the Roman Empire. When Rome began as an empire, it began with the great-nephew of Julius Caesar, Octavian, known to us as Emperor Augustus, who would rule the western leg of the Roman Empire, while Mark Antony, Julius Caesar's most trusted general, would rule the eastern leg from Egypt with his Greek queen and the last of the Greek Ptolemaic dynasty, Cleopatra. The 2 summer months in our calendar today are named after them, July for Julius Caesar and August for Octavian Augustus. When we come to the 10 toes of iron mixed with miry clay, they represent the 10 lost tribes of Israel who had mingled themselves with the other nations. The 10 toes do not represent the provinces of Rome for this time, since there were more than 10 provinces, nor does it represent the 10 districts of the Club of Rome, which is what is preached by Zionists today. The prophet Jeremiah refers to the house of Israel as clay and reminds the Jews that Joseph's son Ephraim is God's firstborn and heir. O house of Israel, can I not do with you as this potter, saith the Lord? Behold, as the clay is in the potter's hand, so are you in my hand, O house of Israel. Jeremiah also reminds us that the Jews are not the chosen tribe, since it was clearly given to Ephraim, the son of Joseph, God's firstborn and heir, who was scattered among the nations. They shall come with weeping, and with supplication will I lead them. I will cause them to walk by the rivers of waters in a straight way, wherein they shall not stumble. For I am the father of Israel, and Ephraim is my firstborn. Hear the word of the Lord, O you nations, and declare it in the isles afar off. and say, He that scattered Israel will gather him, and keep him as a shepherd does his flock. For the Lord has redeemed Jacob, and ransomed him from the hand of him that was stronger than he. The stone represents the coming of Christ, and how all the empires would be shattered by his coming. The stone that the Jews rejected became the head of the corner, as we read in both the Old and New Testament. And have ye not read the scripture, the stone which the builders rejected is become the head of the corner? As the Roman Empire began as a divided two-legged empire, it would end the exact same way. Over the centuries that followed, the Roman Empire would become Christian, fulfilling the prophecy of Daniel. The two Christian legs of the Roman Empire can still be seen today, the eastern leg representing the Eastern Orthodox Church and the western leg representing the Roman Catholic Church. The Jewish Roman historian Flavius Josephus leaves us with a very remarkable statement. When Josephus is writing about the prophecy of Daniel, you will notice that he doesn't explain to the Romans what the stone represents, since he is not a prophet predicting the future, but a historian writing about past and present events. Daniel did also declare the meaning of the stone to the king, but I do not think it proper to relate it, since I have only undertaken to describe things past or things present, but not things that are future. Yet if anyone be so very desirous of knowing truth, as not to waive such points of curiosity, and cannot curb his inclination for understanding the uncertainties of futurity, and whether they will happen or not, let him be diligent in reading the book of Daniel, which he will find among the sacred writings. Josephus doesn't seem to want to mention to the Romans that one day Rome will be subject to this stone, since Josephus understands perfectly well that the stone represents Christ, since he referred to Jesus as the Messiah. Now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it be lawful to call him a man, for he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as receive the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. He was the Christ. Coming back to our story, in 601 BC, about 2 years after the great king's dream, Nebuchadnezzar prepared another expedition against Egypt. The king of Judah, Jehoiakim, decided not to pay the Babylonians their tribute, assuming that Egypt would join forces with Judah. However, Egypt did not come to the rescue of Jehoiakim, and Jerusalem was besieged. According to Josephus, Jehoiakim was thrown from the walls of Jerusalem, and his son Jeconiah, or Jehoiachin, was made king. Nebuchadnezzar would take him hostage, along with many of the nobles and most prominent citizens of Judah, making Jehoiachin's uncle Mattaniah king of Judah and renaming him to Zedekiah. At the beginning of the 20th century, Robert Coldaway, an archaeologist, did discover a clay tablet that mentions Jeconiah or Jehoiachin by name, describing the food rations given to him and his family. This can be seen in the Pergamum Museum in Berlin, Germany today. King Zedekiah didn't learn from the mistakes of Israel and the kings of Judah before him. He trusted in Egypt and would rebel against Babylon, resulting in all his sons being killed before his eyes and his eyes being put out, as he was taken to Babylon in chains, where he died, fulfilling the prophecy of Ezekiel. Say thou unto them, Thus saith the Lord God, this burden concerning the prince in Jerusalem and all the house of Israel that are among them. My net will I also spread upon him, and he shall be taken in my snares, and I will bring him to Babylon, to the land of the Chaldeans, yet he shall not see it, though he shall die there. The prophet Jeremiah was imprisoned in Jerusalem by Zedekiah, but would be set free by the Babylonians, and was given the option to go to Babylon or stay in Jerusalem. Jeremiah had been warned by God not to go into Egypt, where many of the Jews had fled, since Egypt was about to meet the same fate as Judah. In 586 BC, Jerusalem and the Temple of Solomon was razed to the ground. Nobody knows what happened to the prophet Jeremiah and his scribe Baruch after they went into Egypt, but they knew not to stay there and most likely boarded a ship and sailed far away from the east. While the male line of King David was exterminated in Jerusalem, a remnant of David's line would be spared in Babylon, as well as the female line was preserved with the prophet Jeremiah through the daughters of Zedekiah. Legend has it that Jeremiah took the daughters of David's royal line and journeyed across the Mediterranean, where they were married into the royal houses of Europe. There is a cryptic message in the book of Ezekiel, in chapter 17, that alludes that God had prepared a far distant country where the Israelites had set up a kingdom, and that Jeremiah would take the daughters of David's line to be joined together with the lost house of Israel among the Aryans. The legends surrounding the British Isles and Ireland speak about princesses who came from Egypt or Phoenicia and are the ancestors of the Gaels or the Gala, the exiles. Legends say that Scotland gets its name from a princess who came from Egypt. Also, the Scottish in the 12th century openly called themselves descendants of Israel in the Declaration of Arbroath. Irish legends also talk about how the tribe of Dan, or the Tuatha De Danann, had conquered Ireland in the centuries before, which would explain the Hebrew and Phoenician influence in the ancient runes used by the Germanic people. Also, the legend surrounding the oldest city in Germany says that it was founded by people from the ancient Assyrian Empire. Later in the book of Daniel, when the Jews were captives in Babylon, Daniel writes very openly about the sins of Israel and Judah, as he separates the two houses, and not only addresses the Jews in captivity, but also addresses the Israelites who had been scattered around the world. And I prayed unto the Lord my God, and made my confession, and said, O Lord, the great and dreadful God, keeping the covenant and mercy to them that love him, and to them that keep his commandments. We have sinned and have committed iniquity. We have done wickedly, and we have rebelled, even by departing from thy precepts and from thy judgments. Neither have we hearkened unto thy servants the prophets, which spake in thy name to our kings, our princes, and our fathers, and to all the people of the land. O Lord, righteousness belongeth unto thee, but unto us confusion of faces, as to this day, to the men of Judah, and to the inhabitants of Jerusalem, and unto all Israel that are near and that are far off throughout all the countries whither thou hast driven them, because of their trespass that they have trespassed against thee. While most of early biblical history is focused around Egypt and Mesopotamia, the Bible says Egypt and Babylon would meet their ends and be abased. Egypt and Babylon will never rule over the nations again, to this very day. And I will bring again the captivity of Egypt, and will cause them to return into the land of Pathros, into the land of their habitation, and they shall be there a base kingdom. It shall be the basest of the kingdoms, neither shall it exalt itself any more above the nations, for I will diminish them, and they shall no more rule over the nations. And I will render unto Babylon and to all the inhabitants of Chaldea all their evil that they have done in Zion in your sight, saith the Lord. Behold, I am against thee, O destroying mountain, saith the Lord, which destroyeth all the earth, and I will stretch out my hand upon thee, and roll thee down from the rocks, and will make thee a burnt mountain. And they shall not take of thee a stone for a corner, nor a stone for foundations, but thou shalt be desolate forever, saith the Lord. After the death of Nebuchadnezzar, his son Evil Marduk, or Amel Marduk, would rule for about 2 years, until he was overthrown by Nergal-Sharezer. Both these men are mentioned in the Bible. Nergal-Sharezar's son, Labashi Marduk, would be crowned after and only rule for about 9 months, until the last king of Babylon, Nabonidus, would launch a coup and take the throne. While the Bible calls the king of Babylon Belshazzar in chapter 5, he was not the true king, but was only ruling for his father, King Nabonidus, who was a religious man and had devoted his life to his religion. Belshazzar can be found on the cylinder of Nabonidus, which was discovered in 1854 by John Taylor. Right before the destruction of Babylon, Belshazzar decided to have a grand feast, where he brought all the vessels and treasures from the temple of God and engaged in drunkenness and debauchery. He invited all his nobles, his wives and concubines to feast, where they degenerated themselves, mocking the God of Israel. But little did they know that God was orchestrating their demise and slaughter, and in the blink of an eye their kingdom would be taken from them, and all their families would cease to exist, and be blotted out of the book of the living. While they feasted and drank wine out of the treasures from Jerusalem, a mysterious hand would show up among the shadows and flames. Prince Belshazzar and his guests trembled in fear as the fingers began to spell out words that none of them could understand their meaning, and very quickly their moods changed. He ordered all the astrologers, Chaldeans, and wise men of Babylon to come and to interpret the writing on the wall, for which none of them were able to do. One of the king's wives reminded the king of Daniel, who Nebuchadnezzar had once made chief over all the wise men of Babylon, and that the spirits of the gods did dwell among him. Belshazzar promised a scarlet robe, a gold chain, and power to any man who could interpret the meaning. When Daniel arrived, he told the king that he can keep his corrupt gifts and rewards to himself, but he would still make known unto the king the meaning of the writing on the wall. For all the greatness and glory that God had given to Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon, he would give to another, because Belshazzar did not humble himself before God, but instead raised his hand against the God of heaven, and worshipped the material world instead of the God who created it. For his mockeries against the God of heaven, whose hands his very breath did rest, Belshazzar preferred to worship his gods of gold, silver, brass, iron, wood, and stone. So God wrote this message on the wall, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Farsin. This message interpreted by Daniel to mean, Mene, God has numbered thy kingdom and finished it. Tekel, thou art found weighed in the balances and are found wanting. Perez, thy kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. Then did Belshazzar clothe Daniel in scarlet, and put a chain around his neck, and proclaimed him the third most powerful man in Babylon. In that very night was Belshazzar and all his nobles slain by the Medes and Persians. While it is disputed among scholars how the great city of Babylon was taken in a single night, the Greek historian Herodotus gives us an interesting account. While the Babylonians were feasting and celebrating, Cyrus and his Medo-Persian army had diverted the Euphrates River, using their channeling and engineering skills, and took the city completely by surprise. Just like today, the people of Babylon had grown tired of their rulers, and after Cyrus had them all killed, he was welcomed as a hero. I wonder how many of us would mourn our leaders today if some great general were to come and have them all executed for their treasons against God and their crimes against humanity. We will continue with Cyrus the Great and the great Achaemenid dynasty, which will be the first Aryan nation to rule over the civilized world. For the hour of his judgment has come. Worship him that made heaven and the earth and the sea and the fountains of water. Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great, who made all the nations to drink of the wine of the wrath of her fornication. And the kings of the earth have committed fornication with her, and the merchants of the earth are waxed rich through the abundance of her delicacies. For her sins have reached unto heaven, and God has remembered her iniquities. Reward her even as she has rewarded you. Render unto her double according to her works. In the cup which she has filled, fill to her double. How much has she glorified herself, and lived deliciously? So much torment and sorrow give her. For she saith in her heart, I sit a queen, and am no widow, and shall see no sorrow. Therefore shall her plagues come in one day, death and mourning and famine, and she shall be utterly burned with fire. For strong is the Lord God who judgeth her. And the kings of the earth who have committed fornication, and lived deliciously with her, they shall bewail her, and lament her, when they shall see the smoke of her burning. For they shall drink the wine of the wrath of God, which he has prepared in the cup of his anger. And they shall be tormented with fire and brimstone, and the smoke of their torment shall go up forever and ever, and they shall have no rest day and night. Here is the patience of the saints that keep the commandments of God and the faith of Jesus Christ.
Прости, что эти люди злы, что в мире сумрака и мглы живут, всем вопреки с собой воюя. Позволь забыть, простить, любить и жить.